Right, well, I think we'll make a start. So you're all very welcome to this afternoon's Irish Studies Research Seminar. And normally we'd have a chair and a speaker here this afternoon, but we decided to cut out the middleman, and I'll fulfill both of those functions this afternoon. So I think most people know me, but if there's anyone who doesn't, I'm Peter Gray. I'm Peter Gray, Professor of Modern Irish History and Director of the Institute of Irish Studies here at Queen's. Published a number of works relating to the Great Irish Famine, and I have a book coming out hopefully in 1 week's time, if the printers do their job, on William Sharman Crawford and Ulster radicalism. And for anyone who's able to come, we will have a launch in the Irish Studies seminar slot on the 11th of December of that book, along with Sean Farrell's new book on Thomas Drew and the making of Victorian Belfast. You're very welcome to come to that event as well. But what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is a related but rather different topic. Charles Gavan Duffy and the land question in Ireland and colonial Victoria, 1850 to 80, and mostly focusing on the 1850s and 60s. This is work in progress, part of a project to identify the transnational dimensions and legacies of the Irish land movement of the 1840s and 50s that took a concrete form in the Irish Tenant League, founded in 1850, but which had disintegrated within Ireland itself by 1858. My recent work has focused on the leadership of that rather understudied movement, especially in Ulster, where the radical landowner William Sharman Crawford and the Presbyterian newspaperman James McKnight were the leading lights. But it was another Ulsterman, the Monaghan-born Charles Gavan Duffy, who perhaps most self-consciously sought to export the politics of the Irish land movement to a very different political environment from 1856, that is the Australian colony of Victoria. Although, as I'll explain, he was certainly not alone in seeking to do this. So this is an attempt to draw together some thoughts on that subject, and I welcome any comments and questions which may help me in taking this forward. And I'm aware there are people in this room who know a lot more about Irish Australian history than I do, and I'm sure there are also people online. So I welcome comments, constructive comments, to taking this forward towards publication. And I'd also like to formally thank the administrators of the O'Donnell Fellowship at the University of Melbourne for the opportunity to carry out research on this project in Victoria earlier this year. So the Irish Tenant League, despite its importance as a forerunner of the obviously much more successful Irish Land League of 1879 to 82, has been poorly served by historians, in part due to its unquestioned failure to attain its ends in the 1850s and its early disintegration. Nevertheless, at its height in 1850 to 53, it was a formidable mass movement with some electoral success attained through its alliance with the Catholic Defence Association in 1852, and considerable engagement from Irish tenant farmers in the wake of the Great Famine. There's not an immense amount of visual culture associated with the Tenant League, but there is one, I think, very striking image from the Illustrated London News in 1850 of a mass meeting in the city of Kilkenny, which I put on the screen. The Tenant League's genesis lay in a combination of local initiative emerging first in Cork and Derry in 1847, at opposite ends of the country, and later in a number of other points in the north and south from mid-1849, with extensive support from both Catholic and Presbyterian parochial clergy, a legislative agenda drawn from the tenant right bills of Sharman Crawford, and the endorsement of reformist and nationalist newspapers, north and south. Charles Gavan Duffy's involvement in the tenant right movement was belated, but subsequently enthusiastic. Best known as the founding editor of The Nation newspaper in 1842 and the facilitator of Young Ireland cultural politics, Duffy had been arrested and his newspaper suppressed in the lead up to William Smith O'Brien's abortive rebellion in July 1848. But prosecutions against him had failed and he was released in April 1849, relaunching The Nation later that year, and now explicitly eschewing what he described as Mitchellism, while identifying agrarian agitation as his new priority. As he assured his former Young Ireland correspondents that year, the protection of the farmers who were flying daily before the exterminator seemed to me the most urgent business. For nationality, we could do little just now except keep alive its traditions. So, although initially distracted by a scheme to create peasant proprietor freeholds that drew on both the British Chartist land scheme, championed by Fergus O'Connor, and the theorising of John Stuart Mill, by 1850, Duffy had come to regard Sharman Crawford's bills to universalise the Ulster custom, regulate rent by valuation, and at least temporarily curb evictions by law as more practicable. Consequently, he was instrumental, along with McKnight and the Catholic convert editor of the Tablet, Frederick Lucas, in convening the National Convention in Dublin in summer 1850 that would formally establish the Tenant League. Duffy was particularly enthusiastic about the extravagant manifestations of Catholic Presbyterian partnership associated with this phase of the movement, as a practical working out of his Young Ireland ideals, and appears to have coined the phrase popularised in his later History of the Movement, published in 1886, as the League of North and South. McKnight, himself a native Irish speaker from Rathfriland, the former editor of the Belfast Newsletter, enthusiastically welcomed a revival of Young Ireland ideals, now shorn, at least superficially, of its former preoccupation with national independence. Now, here is not the place to expand on the complex dynamics of the movement, nor the details of its acrimonious unravelling from 1853. Suffice to say that Duffy became deeply attached to the principle of independent opposition for League-supported MPs and believed them to be morally committed to this in the wake of the movement's electoral success outside Ulster in the election of 1852, at which he himself was returned for the borough of New Ross. As I said, there's relatively little kind of visual imagery associated with the Tenant League, but there are a small number of cartoons in the conservative British satirical magazine Punch. Two of them are here, which do reflect on it, although focusing more on the Independent Irish Party, or the Pope's Brass Band, as they insisted on continuing to call it. Neither of these specifically referenced Duffy. But Duffy did take the defection of a small group of independent MPs, led by John Sadler and William QUB, to the newly formed coalition government of Lord Aberdeen in early 1853 as a moral betrayal, and the defence of their actions by the northern leaders on pragmatic grounds, as potentially pushing the administration towards tenant right legislation from within, as incomprehensible. Now closely allied with Frederick Lucas, Duffy opted to defend him against Protestant charges of religious controversialism, and in a superheated political environment, the movement began to disintegrate amidst highly personalised bickering. Backing Lucas in his ill-fated appeal to Rome against moves by Archbishop Paul Cullen to silence the movement's clerical activists, Duffy was devastated by Lucas's humiliating defeat, followed by onset of a fatal illness in 1855, and by the acrimonious collapse of his friendship with McKnight, as well as by the ebbing of popular support as the wartime agricultural boom, that is the Crimean wartime agricultural boom, drew tenant farmers away from what appeared to be an increasingly dysfunctional agitation. So this series of setbacks between 1853 and 1855, accompanied by personal financial difficulties, explains Duffy's shock announcement that he would abandon his parliamentary seat and his Irish political career, and that he'd sell the nation in April 1855, as, quote, "there was no longer a field for me in a country which would be induced to repudiate a policy on which its safety and almost its existence depended." His decision to then emigrate to Australia, rather than taking the more well-trodden path of Young Irelanders to the United States, several of whom, including Mitchell and Thomas Francis Mayer, had recently escaped from captivity in Van Diemen's Land. This decision may have been partly stimulated by his active participation in Westminster debates about the new constitutions of the Antipodean colonies, which brought him into contact with colonial agents such as Robert Lowe. By October of 1855, he and his family were en route to Melbourne. Although initially uncommitted as to whether they would settle there or in Sydney, his initial plan was to recoup his fortunes as a barrister, although it seems unlikely he had completely eschewed political ambitions. Although the Melbourne press, drawing on the London papers, depicted him as a castaway from the wreck of the Irish party and as abandoned by all moderate men in Ireland, there was also, evident enthusiasm for Duffy's arrival in Victoria, especially but not limited to the colony's Catholics. Perhaps conscious that they were competing with Sydney, he was greeted at Melbourne Harbour as a celebrity, presented with an address of welcome and invited to a celebratory banquet in the city. Although he was to cultivate good relations with both Irish and reformist politicians in Sydney, the flattering welcome in Melbourne, followed up by the establishment of a public subscription to purchase for him the property then required to qualify for a seat in the new Legislative Assembly, persuaded him both to stay in Melbourne and to endeavour to rebuild his political career there. He and his large family thus found financial stability, enhanced by some modest property speculation, and although he chose to stay well clear of the potentially risky investment in newspapers that had marked his early career. He did, however, quickly become a leading promoter of the idea of the federation of the fractious Australian colonies and of a nascent Australian national identity, reflecting the focus on nationality that had animated the nation under his editorship. So what were his politics to be in this new political environment? Although not fully evident until later, the initial encounter in early 1856 flagged both the advantages and the potential weaknesses of his position as a political blow-in, or in the local parlance, a new chum. Initially welcomed by a wide range of the colony's reformers, who had already set their sights on democratising the limited forms of representative government granted by the British legislation, Duffy's welcoming party was dominated by Victoria's leading Catholic politician, John O'Shannessy. Raised in Tipperary in the 1830s and politically formed in the environment of O'Connelism, O'Shannessy had emigrated in 1839 to the then very new settlement of Melbourne, prospered as a draper, and acquired standing amongst the town's entrepreneurial class. He was soon the preeminent lay Catholic in the colony, a founder of Melbourne's St Patrick's Society, and politically active from the colony's autonomy as Victoria in 1851 as a moderate liberal and an advocate of Catholic interests. With Irish Catholic numbers swollen by an influx stimulated in the early 1850s by the gold rush and high demands for labour, Irish immigration to Australia more than quadrupled to over 100,000 in the decade 1851 to 60, with Victoria receiving a disproportionate share. O'Shannessy put together a formidable political machine and was recognised by 1856 as leader of the parliamentary opposition. So I have a number of slides I'm going to use here from the Melbourne, or the Victorian offshoot of the London Punch, which titled itself Melbourne Punch, established in 1855 in the growing town, in imitation very much of its London progenitor, displaying a similar mix of political and social satire, and generally sharing in its bourgeois, conservative and patriotic politics, including frequent stereotyping of Irish Catholics as ignorant, if devious and occasionally dangerous peasants, and their political leaders as venal, self-important and disloyal. So here we have a very early image of Duffy on arrival being feted as the kind of, you know, the superstar of Irish politics arrived in Victoria, with O'Shannessy in this representation reduced, following the Shakespearean model to the neglected Jack Falstaff in Henry IV. But there's an uncertainty in these representations as to the relationship between these two men. So very soon after, we have this image of now O'Shannessy and Duffy joined in one body as the kind of the Irish giant operating under the shade of Daniel O'Connell and seeking to crush opposition from local Protestant critics. The figure represented here is a man called John Faulkner, long-established colonial figure in Melbourne, and a kind of virulently anti-Catholic politician. So O'Shannessy's patronage provided Duffy with a ready-made political network with an Irish Catholic base, and he soon secured for him a vacant seat in the Victorian Assembly for the Western Rural District of Villiers and Heytesbury. While recognising the advantages thus secured, Duffy had no intention of being merely a cog in O'Shaughnessy's machine, and brought his own political baggage with him. Tensions between O'Connellite and Young Ireland political inheritance would soon bubble to the surface. At a welcome dinner in Melbourne, Duffy praised his new country in the Australian idiom as offering fair play to all, and committed himself to acting within its laws, and thereby implicitly not challenging its established place within the British Empire. But at the same time stating, as is well known, that I am not here to repudiate or apologise for any part of my past life. I am still an Irish rebel to the backbone and to the spinal marrow, because tyranny has supplanted law in my native country. These were stirring words from a man who had and would continue to discountenance future resort to revolutionary violence in Ireland, but who continued to uphold the legitimacy of the 1848 Rising as an honourable act, not least as a protest against the atrocity of famine. But of course, these words created hostages to fortune for his soon-to-be expanding circle of enemies in the colony, and also for O'Shaughnessy, whose growing social conservatism and strategy of demonstrating Catholic respectability would lead ultimately to him opposing Home Rule and losing his seat in the Assembly, at least in part on that matter, in 1883. Although significant prejudice against Irish and especially Catholic immigrants was widespread in Victoria, as Sean Connolly, who's with us today, outlines in his recent comparative survey of Irish migration experience on every tide, the Australian colonies were a more open society, allowing greater opportunities for social advancement, including through land ownership and integration. Nevertheless, the 1850s Irish settlers were generally unskilled and few made fortunes in the gold diggings. The introduction of manhood suffrage in 1856 gave most men the vote, but with property qualifications for seats still in force, only 6 of the 60 elected Assembly members in that year were Irish Catholics. And O'Shaughnessy sought alliances with other liberal factions to maximise his influence based on this ethnic voting bloc. Duffy would consistently promote Irish emigration to Victoria, hoping to attract more of the post-famine stream heading principally for North America. This would, in his view, necessitate opening up land for relatively small purchasers and continuing to assist emigration, given the greater cost of reaching Australia. Duffy's early contributions to the Victorian Assembly were thus as part of O'Shaughnessy's opposition grouping, and focused both on advocating parliamentary reforms and on lecturing rather pedantically his new compatriots on the forms of the Westminster Parliament. He was the only member of the Assembly who had served in the Westminster Parliament, which led to a certain amount of carping, as you can see from these cartoons. But he had not forgotten his adherence to agrarian politics and desire to apply the lessons of Irish tenant politics to the Australian environment. He stated in his rather self-serving memoir of 1898, My Life in Two Hemispheres, the foundations of a new nation were to be laid, the principles for which reformers at home contended might have fair play here. So a brief and rather simplified sketch of the outlines of what the land question was in Victoria is needed here. The lands adjacent to Port Phillip Bay were seized by land-hungry British settlers coming from the nearby colony of Van Diemen's Land in the early 1830s, with the Port of Melbourne established as a settlement in 1835. Reluctantly accepted as a fait accompli by the colonial authorities in Sydney, the territory was at first incorporated into New South Wales. As elsewhere, the pre-existing Aboriginal population was displaced, frequently with extreme violence, on the model already deployed in Van Diemen's Land by wealthy agricultural entrepreneurs who established large sheep runs on these squatted lands. Although few of them were part of the squatter class, Irish migrants were also complicit in this expropriation. And just as an aside, the settler colonial establishment is now widely acknowledged in public heritage institutions in Australia, including in Melbourne. But as we've seen this month with the failure of the Voice referendum, the white majority in Australia still struggles to to attain formal recognition and restitution in Australian society as a whole. In 1851, the territory of Victoria was populous enough to demand and receive separation from New South Wales with its own administration. But it was the discovery of gold in that year that transformed it, drawing in tens of thousands of hopeful diggers and others providing services to them, creating an economic boom that benefited many, but by no means all, of the colony's settlers. The mining population was diverse, with many Americans and Chinese, the latter, of course, subject to prejudice, legal restrictions, and occasional violence. Although the bulk of the population was drawn from the United Kingdom, and around a quarter of Victoria's people were Irish-born by 1856. As the gold rush faltered amid clashes with the state, as at the Eureka Stockade in 1854, over harsh mining regulation and democratic claims, pressure mounted for a more equitable distribution of land, the promotion of non-pastoral forms of agriculture, and the attraction of farmer settlers. By the mid-1850s, most Liberal politicians in Victoria favoured some form of land reform to promote smaller scale settlement or resettlement of former miners, but were acutely divided over how this should be managed and faced determined resistance from the 700 or so wealthy squatter families who held an entrenched position in the upper house, the Legislative Council in Melbourne, and a significant voice in the lower house as well. For Duffy, arriving from Ireland in 1856, the parallels between squatters and Irish landlords may have appeared obvious. While he sought no injustice to the former, he recalled he found himself imperatively drawn to the other side. But he was not alone amongst the Irish in thinking so. Arriving on the same ship with him and sharing numerous conversations was Wilson Gray, the Mayo-born Anglican brother of John Gray, the editor-proprietor of the Dublin Freeman's Journal, who had also been an active supporter of the Tenant League in Ireland. Gray had spent time in the United States and Canada before returning to Dublin in 1848, and combined his interpretations of American Western settlement policy with his Irish experience. But whereas Duffy moved all too rapidly into O'Shaughnessy's political orbit, Gray took a very different pathway, looking to the remnants of the Eureka movement, whose initial leader, James Fintan Lawler's brother Peter, had now adopted a much more conservative tack. Gray participated in late 1856 in the formation of the Victoria Tenant League and became one of its leading spokesmen over the following years. The cartoon here, which is from slightly later, 1859, represents the convention dog with Wilson Gray's face. It's using a visual trope later reused by London Punch in a commentary on the Irish Land League and Gladstone's Land Act, or Land Act of 1881, but the dog drops the bone of real concession in pursuit of the reflected moon of a more radical measure. Behind the scenes in establishing this Victoria Tenant League was another Irishman, John Joseph Walsh, born in East Galway in 1819, who emigrated to Sydney in 1830 and set himself up as a newsagent and democratic political activist in Melbourne from 1853. Walsh was the joint secretary of the Land League and its immediate successor, the Victorian Land and Reform Convention, and remained involved in a range of radical and Labourite campaigns through to his death in 1895. And another Irishman, William Joseph O'Hay, acted as the chair of the corresponding committee of the convention in 1859 and was elected to the Assembly as a convention supporter. By no means restricted to the Irish, the League and the convention also drew on the émigré British Chartist tradition. However, it stepped to the recent Irish Tenant League, a movement which had been reported in the Melbourne press and had been experienced by some other recent immigrants, such as the two Presbyterian clergymen who Duffy lauded as electoral supporters in 1856, and the inhabitants of the village of Killarney, inhabited, quote, by what Duffy described as Irish evicted tenants who had thriven prodigiously in their new home. All of this, I think, has been somewhat overlooked in the Australian literature, which is perhaps understandable given the Tenant League's virtual absence from the Irish historical literature. The convention's demands were uncompromising and tied to the interest of the small farmer, whether an ex-miner or a recent immigrant. The allocation of small farms up to 160 acres to selectors at a low fixed price, with the elite squatters' rights being curtailed, possibly via expropriation, and extensive public lands to be allocated as commonage for settlers. It connected these demands with the need for Victoria to successfully compete in the great land market of the United States and Canada, implicitly for mobile immigrants. And the two images on the right-hand side are from Walsh's papers in the State Library of Victoria, a design for a convention flag, which reuses in a kind of altered form the Eureka Southern Cross flag, but also incorporates a sunburst emblem, which is already being used in Irish nationalist imagery by that time. And below that, a membership card, which reuses that flag emblem and kind of draws on both kind of Chartist membership card traditions, perhaps also O'Connellite Repeal Association card membership illustrations as well. Meeting in Melbourne in summer 1857 as a more democratically elected rival parliament with Grey as its president, the convention launched, as the Tenant League had done previously, its own newspapers, including the short-lived Freeholder and Convention Expositor in 1858 and the Convention and True Colonizer in 1859. It petitioned the Assembly, encouraging its local bodies to send petitions to Melbourne, and actively protested against what it regarded as inadequate or misleading land legislation, such as what it described as the Squatters' Land Bill of 1857. Its rhetoric echoed that of the now defunct Tenant League in Ireland, albeit adapted for a wider audience, reflecting an ethnically mixed constituency in a colonial environment. The convention stated that the people of Victoria ought to and will never consent to the continuance of the squatter occupancy of the public lands, and therefore, while it lasts, however long or short, they will be but tenants at will, holding upon the most doubtful and uncertain tenure possible. It is in the nature of things, then, that such unsettled occupants should draw out of the bosom of the soil the same abundance of produce as the freeholder whose tenure is as secure, as unassailable, and as lasting as the constitutional liberty which he identifies with his own existence and with the name of Englishman. Duffy claimed retrospectively in his memoir to have put the idea of the convention on Irish precedents to Grey, and although supporting evidence for this is absent, it seems likely to have been a significant, the Tenant League seems to have been a significant precedent for that body. Grey himself in 1858 urged his followers to remember the causes of distress in Victoria lay with a few hundred squatters growing disgustingly rich, and would they tolerate being overborne by them as their fathers had allowed themselves to be ground down in the old country. In 1859, the convention held fresh elections and reconvened in Melbourne to press its case. It prepared to run candidates for the Assembly, including Grey, under the new and wider franchise, just as the Tenant League had sought to do in 1852. So the Victoria Land League and the convention posed certain problems for Duffy. He'd initially been very close to Grey, although this relationship soured badly, and he evidently sympathised with its smallholding settler agenda. However, the convention was an oppositional lobby and a protest body, and an impatient Duffy was by now committed to pursuing legislative reform through executive power. Consequently, despite periods of engagement, he tended to keep his distance, and his political manoeuvrings were treated with growing suspicion by the popular body. Within 14 months of landing, Duffy found himself a cabinet member in the first of John O'Shaughnessy's 3 short-lived administrations. Duffy held the key office of Minister of Public Works and Lands, and justified his choice against criticism that O'Shaughnessy had ignored the left and pursued moderates to make up his cabinet numbers, that it was imperative that Irishmen abroad demonstrate their capacity for good governance if self-rule was to be promoted at home. And indeed, a letter to Duffy from Archbishop MacHale of Tuam endorsed such a strategy. Meeting a barrage of anti-Catholic hostility, and with the reformers highly factionalised in the Assembly, the new government postponed its land bill and was defeated on its proposal for a form of proportional representation, which Duffy saw as likely to protect Catholic interests, although he reminded his audience that he was no bigot and had previously worked with Protestant members of the Irish Tenant Right Party. It collapsed. The first government collapsed within 6 weeks. Duffy opposed with fiery rhetoric what he characterised as the pro-squatter terms of a land bill proposed by the succeeding Haynes ministry, and partially aligned himself with the convention in rejection of it. In the highly factionalised environment of Victorian politics, stable ministries were difficult to maintain. And by March 1858, Duffy was back in the same office in the second O'Shaughnessy government, which is represented here in this Melbourne Punch cartoon as a motley band of discordant elements, with O'Shaughnessy himself on the bass drum and Duffy, naturally enough, on the harp. A severe bout of dysentery incapacitated him over several months, which postponed the political crisis, but it could not be avoided when he returned to office in September to find that the Premier, O'Shaughnessy, had been, in his view, subverting Duffy's preparation for his own more liberal land bill. At the same time, what was regarded as temporising by the ministry angered the convention and led to stormy confrontations between Grey and Duffy, and assertions that he was not a Democrat and that he had taken his convention interlocutors to task like a severe pedagogue, sharply catechising a couple of schoolboys. So such sniping was put aside in the wake of Duffy's shock resignation from the ministry on the 15th of March 1859. I said, but before that, there'd been kind of various criticisms made of Duffy in Melbourne Punch, that he, could not cope with the criticisms of him made by the Melbourne press and was yearning to look back to the glory days of running the nation, or on the other hand, that he and O'Shaughnessy were revolutionary Republicans about to impose a kind of dangerous democracy on the colony. In fact, they're falling out over really quite profound issues as this government proceeds. Sniping against Duffy was put aside in the wake of his shock resignation from the ministry on the 15th of March 1859, which he was at pains to explain as the consequence of a fundamental division over land policy arising from O'Shaughnessy's personal animosity and growing conservatism over the land question. Indeed, O'Shaughnessy himself was to purchase an 18,000 hectare squatter run in 1862. Melbourne Punch mocked that O'Shaughnessy had offered a very handsome sum to a subscription to send Duffy home to edit the Nation again. But the Melbourne Argus's half-serious question of whether the martyred Duffy would now seek to seize control of the convention and lead the people's representatives to victory would be answered in the negative. Duffy did denounce the succeeding administration for being in hock to the squatters, who had captured the leadership of the local press and frustrated the will of the electorate in the interests of speculators and capitalists by tamely allowing his own land bill to be heavily amended in the upper house. Responding positively to such agrarian rhetoric, the convention now pitched for full engagement with Duffy, and Grey at this time praised him as an honourable man and pressed him to chair public meetings at Melbourne's Eastern Market. Duffy maintained some distance, however, from the outdoor agitation. In May 1859, Grey invited Duffy to chair a meeting of the United Australian Society demanding radical land reform under the slogan of free selection. But Duffy declined on the grounds that whilst he was in Parliament, he considered that his place was there. Although he also stated that he approved of public meetings like the present, inasmuch as the legislature never advanced beyond public opinion. So, I mean, what we have here is, this is again, Melbourne Punch cartoon representing Grey at this time as Duffy's cat's paw, quite literally. It's quite playing with the hot coals of sedition in the fireball, while Duffy kind of maintains his distance by not actually putting himself at the head of the outdoor agitation. The failure of Grey to unseat the incoming Premier, Nicholson, in a Melbourne by-election in November 1859 also pointed out the electoral limitations of the convention and the need to maintain alternative routes to power. Cartoon mocking Grey, who's the kind of chief hearse, the chief mourner here at the death of the convention following his failure to defeat Nicholson in the election. So Duffy most likely regarded himself as being vindicated in the strategy of sympathising with the convention but maintaining distance from its public activities, When the frustration in the movement spilled over into rioting on the reserve outside the Victorian Parliament in August 1860. Although the more conservative colonial press held him to be equally culpable with Grey and his allies for such excesses, and several linked the unrest back to their shared Irish rebel history and continued toying with sedition. Nevertheless, Duffy denounced the government's subsequent coercive measures against public meetings and continued to praise Grey as a man of great abilities, truthfulness and forbearance. And he would subsequently speak at the Trades Hall in Melbourne in defence of the increasingly democratic institutions of Victoria against their detractors in Britain and within the colony. However, attempts to build alternative coalitions with the Liberal factions led by William Nicholson and Richard Hales foundered, and a period of self-defined leader of the popular opposition and of the corner party of radicals within Parliament was followed by a failed attempt to establish a democratic ministry with himself as head in 1860, which would have allowed him, in the words of the Melbourne Argus, to fulfil his mission to attain land reform. Grey was offered the post of Solicitor General in this abortive radical ministry, but opted to remain a non-ministerial supporter. So again, the strategies are quite different here. Its collapse set Duffy's political hopes back, although he was eventually to take the Victorian premiership a decade later at the head of another rather shaky political coalition. In the short term, however, he felt bitterness towards the colonial Catholic leader, O'Shaughnessy, and his tactics. In a letter he confided to his old friend William Smith O'Brien, now back in Ireland, that while personally happy and prosperous in Victoria, in politics I have a tolerably good position, with the drawback, which is no doubt right and proper, that I have still to pay the penalty in suspicion and prejudice of having been an Irish rebel. 2 or 3 months ago, I was called on to form a government and my opponents found this a very convenient weapon of assault. The truth is that in Australia, I have applied myself strictly to Australian affairs and studied Australian interests. But what does faction care for that? You will be surprised to learn that Mr. O'Shaughnessy gave the cue for the attack by declaring that I shared my policy here to please the party in Ireland represented by the nation, and that I had expressed in the cabinet sympathy for the Sepoy Mutiny, the Indian Mutiny in 1857, which shocked his sense of loyalty. Every preposterous article in the nation is duly copied by an adverse press to show my opinions. But nevertheless, there has not been a government since I came to this country except one in which I have not either been a member or might have been a member if I'd wished. So despite such sentiments, Duffy found himself under clerical and lay pressure to heal the rift within Catholic ranks at a time of political threats to the colony's financial support for denominational education. This had become embarrassingly manifest in physical confrontations within the St. Patrick's Society of Melbourne, sparked by a proposal that it commission a portrait of Duffy in March 1860. The Argus reported with some glee that the friends of Mr. O'Shaughnessy fell to striking the friends of Mr. Duffy in a rotatory fight with the two principal belligerents in the centre. Generally, Mr. Kelly was struck over the head with sticks. The sticks were fighting sticks and not mere amateur canes, sticks such as Irish gentlemen would use at a fair. Unwilling himself to eschew a Catholic political base in the colony, Duffy felt obliged in public to overcome his personal antagonism, if not his mistrust, of O'Shaughnessy and denounce the intervening administration for flaws in their own land measures and failure to confront the veto on the more radical elements imposed by the Legislative Council, the upper house. The outcome of this series of events was the formation of a third O'Shaughnessy administration in August 1861, with Duffy unexpectedly returning to his post as Minister for Lands, thereby breaking with many of his radical allies, and with a personal mandate to bring in his own land bill for the third time. So the principal achievement of this third O'Shaughnessy administration, Duffy's Land Act of 1862, has attracted significant debate in Australian historiography. For Duffy himself, its passage was the source of much hubristic self-congratulation, and he published several treatises that year commending it both to the Australian and Irish publics as a moment of breakthrough in the interests of the small occupier and against the squatter interest. The bill would, he announced begin the transfer of 10 million acres of good arable land in batches after survey and at a low payment, partly deferred over 8 years, to selector farmers. New settlers would be attracted, indeed assisted by money derived from land sales, not only from Ireland and Britain, but also from Southern Europe, bringing knowledge of Mediterranean farming conditions and crops. Settler farmers on freeholds would thus become masters of the soil from the sea to the centre, even if squatters on land not needed for settlement would retain their holdings. So after a long series of setbacks in both hemispheres, marked by awkward compromises and sharp personal disputes, for a brief moment the passage of the Act appeared to have attained in Australia what he had conspicuously failed to achieve in Ireland in the early 1850s, a land act that empowered the small farmer, even if that term meant something quite different in the Antipodes, against the vested interests of an exploitative landed elite. The Convention and Grey were understandably less impressed by what they regarded as compromises introduced to the bill to appease the pro-squatter Conservatives in the administration and the Legislative Council, and now clashed angrily with Duffy as his bill passed through the Assembly. Their demands for easier purchase terms, stricter residence conditions, and more liberal commonage were dismissed as impractical, but would later be shown to be necessary. Feeling betrayed by his former ally, Grey was propelled into leaving Melbourne for New Zealand in June 1862, where he would later become a district judge at Dunedin, although other members of the convention, such as Walsh, remained active in a range of radical and protectionist organisations. Few were to fully trust Duffy again. There were parallels here, perhaps, with the 1853 falling out between Duffy and McKnight, with the latter maintaining that Duffy's preoccupation with maintaining a revived Catholic independent Irish party had been prioritised at the expense of maintaining meaningful land reform in Ireland. While Duffy's bill passed, within a few months of its implementation, it became clear that flaws in its terms and wording were facilitating manipulation by squatters to acquire large tracts through the use of agents posing as smallholding selectors. Using a technique known as peacocking, squatters often acquired strategic plots with monopoly access to water sources, rendering other nearby selections profitless. Patrick O'Farrell notes that only around 100 bona fide selectors had benefited from Duffy's Act by the time it was replaced in 1865, that many of their successors were hampered by naivety about Australian farming conditions and excessive expectations. Duffy responded to growing criticism by proposing amendments, mostly unsuccessful, and later denouncing the Attorney General as well as the academic drafter of the bill, the Irishman Professor W.E. Hearn of Melbourne University, with a suggestion of deliberate subversion. But as a more recent historian has observed, it seems that Duffy's own impatience and lack of attention to detail had played a significant part in the flawed measure. Hubris and political miscalculation appear more likely explanations for the anticlimactic outcomes of what he had evidently believed to be his contribution to building a new social constitution for the colony. So, although a major setback following the fall of the government in 1863, Duffy spent a year in Ireland to lick his wounds, where he did not disabuse his numerous admirers about the legislative success of his bill in the Antipodes. And although tempted to remain in Ireland, this would not be the end of his engagement with Victorian politics. Returning to Parliament after his absence, Duffy was Premier for a year in 1871-2, an incumbency marred by the mobilisation of intense sectarianism against him and his supporters. He ended his career as Speaker of the Legislative Assembly in 1877-80, before retiring on a generous state pension to France to write his historical tomes and memoirs from 1880. Later legislation by other ministers would seek to redress some of the evident flaws of the 1862 Act, although the squatting interests would retain much of their economic power in the colony. And all the way through his later career, Duffy continues to promote Irish immigration to Victoria and to Australia more generally. to the extent that this is in his later career often used as a subject to mock him. So the first cartoon from Melbourne Punch from 13th of August 1863 comes a week after the fall of the Third O'Shaughnessy Ministry, and we have kind of expectant Irish immigrants pumped up by Duffy's rhetoric about to disembark at Melbourne and expecting to receive patronage, you know, to be promoted to posts within the administration or the police or whatever, being disabused with that because they've arrived too late. Second cartoon, this is from later, from July 1871, with Duffy as premier, welcoming new immigrants who are really kind of Irish peasants dressed up as Italian and German skilled agricultural labourers, because he made a big thing about encouraging these immigrants to develop new agricultural industries such as viniculture. But the fundamental belief is that he's continuing to promote the kind of growth of the Irish migrant community within Victoria. Okay, the Victorian land debate was conducted, as we've seen, entirely within the confines of the demographically dominant settler colonial society, paying little attention to the situation of the displaced native population, which had been devastated since the 1830s, also by diseases of European origin. As Minister for Lands, however, Duffy could not completely ignore the remaining native population, especially when these sought some recognition of their rights. Young Irelanders had in the 1840s rhetorically defended indigenous peoples against British colonial aggression. But taking office in a colonial administration committed to expanding European settlement rendered acting on such principles problematic. And Duffy was initially criticised by some in Melbourne for taking little interest in the native question. Perhaps spurred by this, he does take action in 1859. So his actions later that year, which I'll describe now, suggest at least some openness to an alternative position of just ignoring the native question. On the 7th of March 1859, Duffy received a delegation of elders from the Tongarong people of the Goulburn district of inland Victoria, introduced by the protector of Aborigines, William Thomas, an English Methodist who'd been in the colony since 1839 and spoke a number of the First Nations languages. It seems clear, however, that the agency for this deputation came from the native leaders, named in the press as Beaning, a chieftain, Wonga, we'll hear about again, Munaran, Murin, Parngin, Barupan, and Kuguran, who had previously approached Thomas to intercede for them. Their people's numbers, it was reported, had collapsed from 600 to 82 in 19 years, and they came to Duffy to make a claim for cultivatable land, which they had chosen on the Acheron River, some 80 miles northeast of Melbourne. Interpreting the law as permitting such a grant, Duffy told them that it is, in the opinion of myself and my colleagues, in the highest degree desirable to give to the Aborigines some chance of escaping the ruin and destruction which have fallen on so many of their race. And he gave orders that the area be surveyed and that supplies for settlement be made available to them. Duffy's grant had its supporters, although obviously hugely critical of him and resorting to conventional racialized tropes. Melbourne Punch at least reflected, appeared to support the grant in a letter written to the eponymous Kangaroo Bull, the British colony of Victoria. It published this: I think the total area of the lands to which you, Kangaroo Bull, i.e. Victoria, have dispossessed the Aborigines of Victoria is something over 50 million acres. Not a bad haul, that. And the original owners of the soil come to you with bated breath and whispered humbleness, craving permission to occupy a poor 5,000 acres or so. You could do no less than grant it, of course, but it was a sorry spectacle. Kangaroo, that of those 7 petitioners suing for leave to occupy a narrow corner of the great estate they once possessed in fee. Let the incident be portrayed upon one of the panels of your Hall of Assembly, Kangaroo, of your lasting rapacity and of incontrovertible testimony to the deadly efficacy of your civilization. Now, perhaps this is too sweeping. I mean, implicit criticism of Duffy, if not of the policy here. Duffy had, as Chris Morash observes in his recent book on Young Ireland after 1848, symbolically acknowledged indigenous agency through this act and treated the Tongarong people as political persons by granting them this land. But even this modest concession proved ephemeral. Duffy left office several days later, before the grant was officially gazetted, and promises of practical assistance were not honoured by his successors. Inquiring in December 1859, the then government, Duffy inquiring in December 1859, the then government could not answer his questions as to whether the reservation had actually been established and why considerable sums for its support had been retained by the Treasury. Another question in 1860 on provision of land and education for Aborigines more generally also went unanswered. Well, in fact, what had happened is the Tongarong people had immediately proceeded with Thomas to prepare and mark the boundaries of their 4,500 acre grant. And the Protector noted that the blacks in these ranges are still a fine race, wholesome in appearance, well accustomed to European labour and ready to work and settle on their promised land. By early 1860, potatoes and other crops had been planted and over 100 people were resident. However, the land at Acheron was valuable, which is why they had selected it, as well as being of spiritual significance. And the local squatters of the Goulburn mob resented the loss of territory they believed rightfully theirs and campaigned to have the land grant annulled with the connivance of friendly members of the legislature. Successful in this, the Aborigines were evicted and forced to relocate to an undesirable reserve of much poorer quality land at Mohican, purchased from a bankrupt squatter by the Central Board for Aboriginal Affairs in 1860, an act denounced by Thomas at the time as a breach of promise and still remembered with anger in the oral histories of the Tongarong elders, and where the people came into conflict with ranchers with losses exaggerated for personal gain. This betrayal had wider resonances. The Ballarat Star observed that the Acheron grant had attracted the attention of the native peoples of its district, who had hoped to learn from the Tongarong elders, but that no one could now relate its outcome, and interest had faded. This was, however, not the end, but the beginning of the Aboriginal land movement. Men of the related Woiwurrung people, led by Wonga, had been one of the original applicants to Duffy, and supported by a Presbyterian immigrant couple, Scottish Presbyterian immigrant couple, John and Mary Green, attempted to reoccupy Acheron in 1862, and when this failed, travelled with the surviving Tongarong clan to the Yarra Valley in 1863 and established a settlement at Corrandirk, which they then lobbied the government, including by presenting gifts to the governor for Queen Victoria to recognise as a reservation. Now, Duffy's precise role in this episode is unclear, but the site was gazetted for them on the 30th of June 1863, just several days after the resignation of the third O'Shannessy administration, so he's likely to have some role in the preparation of this second allocation. Ultimately, though, Corrandirk was also broken up by the government by the 1920s, but it would serve as a centre for Aboriginal learning and political activism for many years, especially under the leadership of one of its founders, William Barrack, who's a kind of key figure in the modern Aboriginal consciousness movement within Victoria. So the photograph here is a really interesting one. This is a staged photograph taken in 1865, but representing the Tongarong and Woiwurrung men leaving for Acheron to reclaim the land that Duffy had allocated and taken away from them in 1862. Presbyterian minister is there in the centre of the group. People, Wonga, who's one of the original Duffy applicants, is leading the groups. This photograph has kind of great significance in Aboriginal history as part of this kind of representation of them as political agents demanding the restoration of land rights. If we could be slightly indulgent for a minute, this is obviously me, but this is a photograph taken at the site of the land grant at Acheron, with the mountains which have kind of cultural significance for the Aboriginal people. The Cathedral Range on 26th of January 2023, which is a significant date as Australia Day, or known by the Aboriginal peoples as Invasion Day, with Wayne Atkinson, who I owe a lot to in terms of understanding the kind of subsequent history of what happened at Acheron, who is a an elder of the Yorta people, but also an academic and a land activist, wearing obviously the Aboriginal flag in protest against Australia Day. And Val Noon, who is also an elder of the Irish, Sophie knows well, elder of the Irish community in Melbourne, and a kind of local historian of the Irish in Melbourne of great distinction and knowledge. So a few provisional conclusions. I hope this paper has demonstrated the extent to which Duffy and other recent Irish political immigrants, such as Wilson Gray, consciously sought to export the model of the Irish Tenant League to their transplanted colonial environments, although interpreting it in different ways, perhaps misunderstanding the aspects of Victorian social economy, some aspects of Victorian social economy in that process. It also suggests the ultimately unresolved dilemma within which Duffy operated. Unwilling to renounce his past as an Irish rebel, although his stance in 1848 had actually been hesitant and largely rhetorical, he nevertheless sought both in 1849 to 55 and after arrival in Victoria to adhere to constitutionalist politics, and was wary of becoming too closely associated with on-the-ground agitation, leaving this to others, such as Gray. In an article in the 1862 Land Act fiasco, Eugene Doyle suggests that the convention riot in Melbourne in 1860 spooked Duffy and led him to renounce his former allies and take a more moderate and ultimately compromised political stance. And there's evidently some truth in this, even if Duffy did not immediately break with Gray and still sought to lead the convention-supported corner group. However, it also seems likely that what initially seduced Duffy to enter Victorian politics, the existence of a ready-made political vehicle with a core Irish Catholic electoral bloc, opened to him by John O'Shannessy in 1856, and appearing to offer a roadmap to achievements which had signally failed at Westminster in the early 1850s, offered something of a snare. In the highly factionalized colonial politics of the era, Duffy's Irish and to some extent Catholic identification drew press antagonism and created barriers between him and other radical leaders, which were not helped by his own abrasive and often hubristic personality. The ethnic solidarities of this bloc would not long obscure some profound differences in socio-economic orientation within it, as manifest in Duffy's resignation from O'Shannessy's government in 1859. But ultimately, Duffy found it impossible to construct a stable alternative parliamentary bloc and hesitated to risk the loss of respectability and potentially the exile to permanent opposition by throwing in his lot entirely with the convention and its embrace of class-based politics. Ultimately, his desire to demonstrate that the Irishman could govern, as he boasted to his friends back in Dublin in 1865, was to prove more important than what he had attained in government. Although this might at first appear inconsistent with his purist rejection of any political compromise with British parties in 1852 to 53, it both drew on the experience of political failure that followed and suggests that, in the final resort, for him, land reform was a means to a political end and not the all-encompassing passion that it had been both for McKnight and Sharman Crawford in Ireland and was for Gray and Walsh in Australia. Thank you very much. So, chairing myself, I think we can open it to questions. I'll attempt to answer any questions, but again, very much welcome comments and suggestions. As you know, this is something I want to take forward further for publication. Prof.
Thank you very much for that. It was really interesting. I really like the stuff on Aboriginal land rights. I thought didn't really know much about that. I was just wondering, really, I don't really know much about the Victorian Tenant League. Do you find that there are splits between or tensions between where the power base is, not just in terms of kind of executive politics and kind of more social movements, I suppose, but between physically where, just because I'm thinking in the 1880s we've got with the land league in Victoria, there's massive tensions between the politicians and the activists who are based in Melbourne and those who are based in Ballarat and Bendigo and all of those. And there's a conflict in their kind of hopes, mainly because they're based in either urban or rural areas.
Yeah.
So do you find that happens?
Yeah, I mean, from what I understand, the Tenant League itself is quite short-lived, and the convention takes over. The convention is a body that has multiple branches across, and you go back to that. Yeah, back to that slide. It gives you the list of all the branches, which are just there, numerous branches, and they are out. I mean, both in the mining districts and also in the rural districts, but also very much in the town as well, because the convention is primarily promoting land reform, but it's also very closely aligned to the labour movement and to the incipient 8 hours day campaign, which is kind of emerging in the late 1850s as a major demand of the labour movement in urban Melbourne and surrounding districts. So a lot of the constituencies which they're fighting are in the urban area, in East Melbourne and Collingwood. Collingwood kind of very much a kind of working class district of Melbourne at the time. So so I don't think that there's much evidence of a kind of geographical split in its interests. And it always, I mean, if you read through its publications, there's always a lot of space given to the interests of miners, the continuing, kind of campaigns on the part of diggers for, allotments in particular. So there's a kind of smaller scale kind of land campaign going on there, as well as the kind of bigger campaign for the selection of land for kind of agricultural farmers as well. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, you're concentrating on Duffy trying to export the ideas of the Tenant League to Australia.
Yeah.
And the Australian side of things is fiendishly complicated, and that's obviously what's taking a lot of your time. But the trouble is, the ideas of the Tenant League aren't very clear either. I mean, first of all, it's very much a secular movement. I mean, in the south in particular, it's very much the eastern counties of Ireland, which, relatively large farms, and one part of Ireland where grain growing does still have a future, so that which has major implications for size of holdings that are higher than everything else. But also, when you summarised, what Gavan Duffy takes as the main aims, extending the Ulster custom, controlling rents, it's all within a framework of the landlord and tenant system. But when you go to Victoria, you're talking about creating smallholder proprietors. So it's not really expanding the idea of land. You're exporting the basic idea of a conflict between landlords and disadvantaged tenant, smaller occupiers. But it's not really a political program.
So yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. I mean, the kind of platform of the Tenant League is never fully articulated, and there are a lot of kind of comings and goings as to what the specific content of what it's demanding at any point in time is. And you're absolutely right. In different places in Ireland, it has different social content, if you like. In the north, it very much is a small farmers movement, but in Cork, I don't think it is. It's initial leader in Cork, Trenwith, is a large farmer and also a pawnbroker in the city. So I think it's reflecting a rather different social base. In Kilkenny, it's different as well, around Callan, which very much kind of clerically led. So I think that's true. On the other hand, there is a lot of rhetoric within the Tenant League, and this is again being promoted by Sharman Crawford, in his pamphlet, which becomes in some ways a kind of manifesto for the movement, Depopulation Not Necessary, in 1849. There's a strong element of revival of the idea of the reclamation of wastelands and the creation of small units of land which will be allocated to labourers to make them into small farmers as part of the demands of the League. That's not kind of invented by Crawford. That's been around for quite a while. Been various pamphlets previously promoting that, but that is kind of absorbed into the rhetoric of the League. That's not entirely interested or solely interested in the interest of the small farmer, but it does have this concern about the interests of labourers, and that land reclamation and reallocation of land in small plots will partly address that issue. as well as, you know, the greater employment that will be created by creating tenant security, which is the other dimension. The Tenant League is not calling for, on the whole, for peasant proprietary, although that is in the air, you know, particularly after the publication of John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy in 1848. There's debates there, but it's not regarded as practical politics to demand that in the Irish context in 1850. But at the same time, the rhetoric around a lot of the rhetoric around the establishment, the legal establishment, universalization of the Ulster custom is about dual ownership, you know, obviously, which then reoccurs in the context of the Glaston Land Act of 1881. Dual ownership potentially is a stepping stone to complete transfer of ownership. So, yeah, I mean, obviously the contexts are very different. Inevitably, the contexts are very different. But I think there is enough in the rhetoric of the Tenant League for its ideas to be transferred without major rupture to the Australian context, even if you have to kind of, you know, label the squatters as the landlord class, which is problematic in Australia. But nevertheless, there's an attempt to do that. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of following on from what Sean was saying. It seems to me in the Irish case, we're talking primarily about tenant security.
Yeah.
In the Victorian case, it sounds rather like redistribution of land resources, or at least defining property rights in a manner that would favour smallholders. Yeah. So I just wonder if the echoes in the 1880s with the land war, the redistribution of land within Ireland, it's a very minor theme, but of course it becomes much more important or more significant as a claim during the United Irish League agitation at the very end of the 1890s, and has a kind of the aftershocks of the ranch wars of the early 20th century.
So it's actually, it's not, I mean, I'm not addressing that later phase in what I'm doing here, but I mean, Sophia's written about this, about the visits of Irish land agitators to Australia in the 1870s, 1880s. Yes. There is a significant interest in what's happening here. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I haven't looked at this detail. Obviously, there's a lot of interest in the kind of visiting. Redmond comes, doesn't he? What year is that? 1880? Is that right?
Redmond brothers come in 1882.
Yeah.
It comes at the same time, or 1883, but it comes at the same time as news of the Invincibles comes in. So that isn't understood well, and they're told explicitly, don't bother going to, I think it's Ballarat, because you will get chased out. So you get that, and then obviously Davitt goes back in 1896. So you do get quite a lot, but there is a very explicit acknowledgement that if they're not there, it all kind of falls apart. But I think I mean, in the late 1870s, early 1880s, there's a big push on kind of land reform fundraising, at least. They say that they're sending streams of gold back.
And I'm just following you, thinking about what Sean's written about Irish Australia as well. So there seems to be more sympathy for that than there is for home rule or for overt nationalism within Irish Australia.
Yes, I'd say because it's connected to Australian nationalism, and that being kind of the feeder of the empire.
Yeah. So just quickly, a follow-up. If a selector gets, you said, up to 160 acres, in pure practical terms, what do you actually do with 160 acres in Victoria? What do you actually produce? Yeah,
so the idea is that there'll be mixed. It'll be mixed farming, so that there'll be a certain proportion of that which will be cultivated. You know, and there's some areas in Victoria which do become significant producers of things like potatoes, wheat. But also part of that land, depending on the specific, you know, bundle of land that you get, some of it will also be smaller scale pasture as well. But the argument that the convention is making is that there also needs to be significant commonage, so that any pastoral activity on the part of these kind of settler farmers will be allowed to kind of spill out onto the common land pastures as well. But the rhetoric is very much about tillage, with pasture being a kind of fallback. As we know, the land is more suited in many places, obviously, to pasture than it is to tillage, which is an advantage that the squatters always have in their responses. We are just farming the country in the only way that it can be farmed, over very extensive pastoral ranches.
Which is also true of large parts of Ireland, of course.
Well, same
In
argument,
the
of
market
course.
conditions of the 19th, 20th century.
Yeah.
Yeah, pasture, and as Finford discovered, for example, after 1932, the political and social environment is small scale village farming, the economics going towards pasture.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course there's a long-standing debate about that, both at the time, but also in the economic history literature as well, which we don't really want to get into today, as to whether that is a natural kind of environment, or whether that is structured by the demographic and agricultural outcomes of the Great Famine in ways that might not otherwise have been the case. So, but obviously, as you know, there's a debate about that. Okay, do we have questions online?
Yeah, there's one from Patrick Duffy. So he asks, is there any evidence to suggest that Duffy's upbringing in the religiously mixed area of Monaghan and his relationship with Protestants / criticism of Orangism in my life, and to have a serious influence his approach to native Australians?
Gosh, I don't know. That's the answer to that. So Duffy's formation within young Ireland ideology, the kind of orange and green will carry the day stuff, is very much, I think, a formation of his experience in Dublin rather than in Monaghan. But I could be wrong about that in his association with Davis and Dillon. I mean, when he's a newspaper editor in Belfast with running the Vindicator in 1839, 1840. I mean, he's not a particularly ecumenical figure, in that newspaper. It's very much defending the interests of Belfast Catholics against what is seen as Orange aggression. So, I mean, I don't know enough about his life in Monaghan really to make a call on that, but I suspect really it's very much the influences that he comes under in Dublin in the early 1840s that lead him to kind of adopt this kind of young Ireland position.
Just on that. I would also say where he's based in Victoria is really important. Yeah. Victoria sees itself very much as not a place for convicts, but also as completely different in their approach to Aboriginal people to the rest of Australia. They're the only ones that actually have a treaty with Aboriginals, but also, I mean, it's a kind of a fake treaty, but they at least pretend to have a treaty. But also, if you look at a lot of the newspaper reports, they're like, oh my gosh, look at what they're doing in Queensland, look at what they're doing in New South Wales. We would never do such a thing in Victoria. So he's part of that kind of rhetoric as well, even if he doesn't really live up to it.
No, I'm sure. I mean, I don't think his interest or attachment to Aboriginal land rights goes particularly deep. It's interesting that he does make this grant, I suppose, when he could have said no to it, I suppose, in 1859. And there were echoes. He's asking questions about, well, what happened to those people for a couple of years afterwards, but it doesn't really seem to be a major issue for him. Again, I haven't really got to his role in 1863 at this point. So I don't want to kind of portray him in any way as a kind of hero of Aboriginal land rights. Certainly the government as a whole, of course, in 1858-59 has decided that this is an acceptable policy if a minister chooses to enact it. So that may reflect something of what you're suggesting about Victoria being rather less regressive than some of the other colonies at the time.
It is sometimes brought into an Irish context as well in ministers' debates in the 1840s and 1850s. But again, what people say versus what they do.
Yeah. I mean, what they do. I mean, set against the kind of it's the Batman Treaty of whatever it is, 1835 or yeah. But I mean, set against that is this kind of wave of squatters coming in from Van Diemen's Land. Have already kind of more or less wiped out the indigenous population of Van Diemen's Land. So I mean, what they say and what they do are obviously quite different things, I think, in Victorian, and that, if you like, original sin is carried across the Bass Strait from Van Diemen's Land, isn't it? In terms of practice. And by the time people like Duffy are starting to think, well, maybe we should make some amends, or maybe the kind of Melbourne Punch is saying, well, maybe amends should be made. It's very late in the day. Even those figures that the press give of the demographic collapse of the Aboriginal population groups, indicate that this is a kind of minor act of restitution at best, I think. But anyway, I'm not an expert in this, so I suspect not. Yeah, Eamon?
Just really on that point, I think one measure of how deeply, his principles in regard to First Nation people would run is actually, does he at any point ever temper the encouragement